Okay, so welcome, and let me greet those who are tuned in and will be watching the video recording a little at their leisure. Without going into the tonight's details, you've got an outline on the screen. I want to begin in a slightly different way. I'm holding here in my hand, if the light's good enough, you'll see I'm holding a needle. And it's just an average size needle. And this is what one might do with this needle. Go outside on a dark, clear night, hold it at arm's length in order to see what you can see through the eye of a needle in the dark part of the sky where you're fairly sure there are no stars. So that's what we're doing. You won't see any stars if you've chosen the right place in the sky. But according to the Hubble telescope, what you are looking at through that needle, even though you don't realise it, is 20,000 galaxies. Move the needle 2 to 3 centimetres one way, another different 20,000 galaxies. Move it up and down, roundabout, 20,000 galaxies. Each galaxy containing between 100 and 200 billion stars. Now that is, as they say, mind-boggling, isn't it? It happens to be reality. It happens to be what there is in the sky. And here it is. Unlimited vision, 10,000 galaxies, sorry, not 20, 10,000 galaxies, and approximately 1 trillion galaxies, in fact, in the visible sky, except our eyes, of course, can't see it. Now, why do astronomers reach for such huge numbers? Well, it's because, in particular, of what the Hubble Space Telescope has disclosed. Here, in fact, according to NASA, is what you actually do see through one eye of a needle part of the universe, of the cosmic sky. And as I say, move it backwards and forwards, and each of the galaxies containing 100 to 200 billion stars. And of course, that's only what the Hubble telescope has disclosed. With this new Webb telescope, depending on which part of the electromagnetic spectrum the Webb telescope is going to be focused on, there'll be 100 or 1,000 times more access to what's there. So multiply images like this by 100 or 1,000. That's what the Webb telescope is going to be disclosing. So that's why astronomers come up with those sorts of numbers. Okay, so this is where we're going. Looking at the possibilities of intelligent material life. By intelligent, I'm meaning if we were to find life at the level of a bacterial level or a viral level somewhere. That's not the kind of life we're talking about. We're talking about life that's reached what we might call a level of conscious intelligence or intelligent consciousness. Material, because I'm not talking about the existence of a spiritual realm invisible to the human eye. I'm talking about material intelligent life that we could communicate with, that we could observe, and presumably that could observe us elsewhere in the cosmos. And we'll be talking about the probabilities that are attached to these kinds of claims, the great silence about why we haven't actually seen them or they've not arrived yet, and what all of this says to us about the God who is the creator and made known to us through the Christ who has a cosmic dimension as well. So we'll get going through these slides. Now, there's quite a lot of technical information in the slides. We're just going to have to, I want to be reasonably complete without trying to be anything like encyclopedic. So we'll go through 22 slides, in fact, and then at the end there's a 23rd slide which I think will just bring it all together and enable you to offer your comments and questions. So a summary is on its way. Now, the reason I'm talking in this way is because I, for reasons to do with my past, am fixated a little bit on scientific abstracts. And what I've noticed over the last 10 or so years is that every month, in at least the abstracts that I see, there are about 5 new papers in the area of extraplanetary discovery. And just a little example of them. I see an article in the Astronomical Journal about half of Sun-like stars could host rocky, potentially habitable planets. The presence of a so-called Earth around the nearest star, Proxima Centauri. The ESO, the European Telescope, discovered the first ever image of a multi-planet system around a Sun-like star. Astrobiology concluded quite recently alien civilizations may number in the trillions. Spitzer Space Telescope, a system of 7 Earth-sized planets. Atmosphere now detected around an Earth-like planet, and so on. That's what's appearing in the literature. Just in the last 3 months, January, February and March of this year, here are some of the headlines that I saw. The birth of planets in a binary star system is observed in unprecedented detail. So you've got a system with 2 suns, and the planets that are being born there are observed in unprecedented detail. This discovery of the largest molecule yet, dimethyl ether, in a planet-forming disk. Now this is important because dimethyl ether is important in forming complex organic compounds, which are the basis, at least for all life that we know. Now we know it can be seen in a planet-forming disk. And NASA's been up to enlisting theologians to try to assess how the world would react if this life was discovered. Seasons have been now discerned on a planet outside our solar system. Planetary bodies in the habitable zone of a dead star. The first rugby ball-shaped exoplanet has been discovered. I think that's very significant, of course, for Kiwis, finding a rugby ball-shaped planet. Now, what do these sorts of actual findings indicate or possibly suggest? They seem to indicate that the cosmos and its galaxies are, among other things, an enormous incubator for planets with life-forming potential. That's not an a priori claim, it's a claim that derives from observation, from evidence. So we end up with, for example, the European Space Agency. Now this is a very conservative, German-dominated agency. It estimates there are about 10 to the 24, big number, stars in the observable universe. They say this implies a lowest estimate of some 10 to the 14 Earth-like planets. And that's, of course, well before the Webb telescope was launched, which is expected to amplify these sorts of numbers. This estimate of 10 to the 14 Earth-like planets amounts to 100 such planets existing for every grain of sand on planet Earth. That's a lot, isn't it? And this implies some 10 to 20 billion potentially habitable planets in our own Milky Way galaxy. So, quite apart from galaxies far, far away, our galaxy, the Milky Way galaxy, has, so we're told by these astronomers, some 10 to 20 billion potentially habitable planets. NASA's continued to refine the number of other potential Earths detected. The numbers shrunk recently. They're being even stricter about what might qualify as an Earth-like planet in a habitable zone, so-called Goldilocks zone. The number's now 2,974, just a month or so ago. And the same NASA document, so far our home is unique in the universe for life, for its ability to support life. Now, what kind of probabilities are there that there might be intelligent life among this huge number of potential Earth-like planets? Well, the possibilities of communicating alien civilizations in our own Milky Way galaxy. Now, there's an older equation that you sometimes come across, which has been expanded just a few years ago as the so-called Frank and Sullivan equation, to calculate the number of advanced civilizations that have existed in our galaxy throughout the whole history of the universe. So this is published in Astrobiology. There's the formula that they used, and I'll just show you that in a little more detail, because you'll realise it is somewhat speculative in places. So this is the Frank and Sullivan equation. So N is the number of civilizations with which we could communicate. And you've got to put together, and you just run your eye down what's the various parts of that equation. When you get about halfway down, the fraction of life supporting planets that develop life, yeah, a certain amount of guesswork involved there. The fraction of planets with life where life develops intelligence, at the moment, 0. But potentially you could refine data that comes to us in order to get an answer to that question. And the fraction of intelligent civilizations that develop communication, again, we're guessing at this, but in order to find the number of civilizations with which we could communicate, you need to throw these into the equations. And then out at the end, the length of time during which these civilizations could communicate. rather bizarre factors enter here. How long would it take a civilization to be able to communicate with us? The end point being when that civilization, for one reason or another, ceased to exist. Either it committed suicide, or its star died, and the civilization died with it. So, and even that equation, complex though it is, has been refined yet again, because that that previous equation, the Frank and Sullivan equation, says, well, their initial estimate of what's going on as the end result of this equation, they suggest there should be over 30 active communicating intelligent civilizations in our home galaxy, the Milky Way. But that was a whole 4 years ago. Last year, even that equation was qualified. An astronomer called John Gertz has made a case for rewriting the Frank and Sullivan equation, and the paper's been accepted for the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. It hasn't actually appeared in print yet, but that's what they've promised, a revised and refined version of that complex equation from Frank and Sullivan. And the reason for the revisions that constantly occur is, even since the Frank and Sullivan equation was constructed, planets with oceans have been found in the Milky Way galaxy. And the adjective that was used was planets with oceans are common in the Milky Way galaxy. Now you see, that's a huge advance in terms of the search for potential life. Hubble, of course, has been able to find a gallery of dusty star systems revealing exoplanet nurseries. There are whole nurseries of planet-forming galaxies just popping out planets from complex nurseries. Water may be naturally occurring on all rocky planets. If a planet is rocky, neither gaseous nor some other texture, if it's rocky, the understanding so far is that there will be water on all of those, or likely to be water. In fact, some planets may be even better for life than planet Earth, more hospitable, more likely to bear life. So we'll come back to that in a moment to ask the God question about all of that. And the search for such life continues. One of the more interesting continuations of the search is, you may have heard about the square kilometre array. Well, here's a radio telescope whose diameter is something like, I don't know what that is, 30, 40 metres. If you string together radio telescopes in South Africa, Australia, New Zealand and Latin America, you have the equivalent of a radio telescope, a square kilometre in size. Now, a huge amount of information comes to us through radio telescopes this size. You can begin to imagine the potential for a radio telescope 1 square kilometre in size, the amount of information that will collect. And the square kilometre array will be able to detect extremely weak radio leakage from any extraterrestrial civilization. That's how powerful it is, if such civilizations exist. In fact, by the middle of this decade, the people launching the square kilometre array, it's already working in part, but by the middle of this decade they're saying they will be able to detect the equivalent of airport radar if it's present and functioning on the nearest 50 planetary neighbours outside our solar system. So we could be on the verge of enormous breakthroughs in terms of the gathering of evidence, or a continuing great silence. And it's not because we're not looking. As you can see in this example, we certainly, the planet Earth certainly is looking. Now, the conclusion that astronomers come to, throwing all of the information I've just given you together, is that we're probably not alone in the material universe. The probabilities of life, given all those factors that I've just thrown at you, suggest what one of the journals calls the probability of life among trillions of planets. We're surrounded by billions of planetary systems that could in principle host some form of life. These 10 to the 14 exoplanets are very diverse, ranging from giant balls of gas to small rocky worlds and large super-Earths, that each in their own way potentially could host life. We'll soon be able, especially with Webb, to detect and actually measure traces of oxygen, water, carbon dioxide, chlorophyll, and some complex organic molecules, and even the equivalent of airport radar on the nearest planets. So we are on the verge, I think, of knowing an enormous amount more about these exoplanets, these 10 to the 14 exoplanets. Now, I can point you to another article in one of the journals which does a Bayesian analysis of all the probabilities and concludes that the odds of life and intelligence emerging beyond our planet, 4 to 3 in favour. So it's that's an interesting conclusion. Probably, given what we're looking at, intelligent, communicable life ought to be present. But that, of course, raises another question. How should we react when, in fact, if it were to be discovered, if such extraterrestrial life were to be detected or arrives? 4 possibilities. Here are the 4 things that we might do, or 4 questions we might ask. Should we be welcoming? Because if they're smart enough to have arrived here, they must be smart or benign enough not to have destroyed themselves. So those are that possibility. Smart enough to arrive and smart enough not to have destroyed themselves. And there's an interesting article, CT, Christianity Today, love thy extraterrestrial neighbour. Or should we be curious but neutral? Just curious as to what are you dudes up to, but not necessarily putting out a welcoming mat? Should we be cautiously alert? Because technologically they would, I think, more or less by definition, be infinitely, well, hugely more powerful than we are. We'd be more or less defensive if they turned nasty, probably. Or should we be actually negative? There's danger. By the time we realised we were in trouble, it would be too late. Stop messaging them and stop searching. That's Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking is very strong on this. Stop looking for them. Stop telling them we're here, because it could really spell destruction. So those are some possibilities in terms of what we might do when extraterrestrial life is found or arrives. However, this raises yet another huge question. Why the silence? Why have we never heard from them, heard them, seen them? We've been searching for a little while in terms of the age of our civilization. There is what has been called an eerie silence that we do encounter. In fact, life might not exist anywhere in the entire cosmos. The rare Earth hypothesis, as it's called, would explain the 70 years of fruitless searching and listening. One of Einstein's mates, Enrique Fermi, there should be billions of civilizations like ours. He started to do the maths as well. Many of them vastly more advanced due to being hundreds of millions of years old and so capable of reaching Earth and so on. We should be overwhelmed by intelligence signals. The search for extraterrestrial life should be successful. Instead, what do we meet? We actually meet silence. By the occasional alarm that we might have seen something. The searchers for intelligent life occasionally throw up alarms. There is silence. Perhaps it's not enough, as I say in the concluding paragraph there, perhaps not enough to be in a Goldilocks zone. And many planets are what you might call Goldilocks zones. Water, atmospheres, not too hot, not too cold. Life requires a perfect mix to create a very precise cradle for life to arise. These are the only conditions that life can exist in. Perhaps they don't exist anywhere else. So perhaps the search is telling us, or the science is telling us, there is no life anywhere else. Perhaps that's what conclusion we ought to come to, even if a tentative one. Perhaps we really are alone as intelligent life. And Zygon, one of the smarter science and religion journals, had a whole issue a while ago. One of the lead articles was, "Alone in the universe." We are probably alone in the universe. One of the contributors in the same journal, one could conclude that we are alone, at least for all practical purposes, either for a while or forever. For practical purposes, because if we find the life, it will be so far away, we couldn't get to it, it probably couldn't get to us, so we practically are alone. Or Anthony Lane, a British theologian, well, we cannot exclude the possibility of the current existence of extraterrestrial life in our galaxy, let alone the rest of the universe. It's unlikely that we would ever have meaningful contact. And some even more forceful, the well-known English physicist Brian Cox, he's quite certain humans are the only form of life in our galaxy, perhaps in the whole universe, despite the astronomical number of other planets. There's only one advanced technological civilization in this galaxy, and there has only ever been one, and that's us. We are unique. So despite tempting you with all those numbers and probabilities at first, here's a physicist who's also surveyed the air and says, it shows nothing except our aloneness. And philosophically, this raises all sorts of issues. It doesn't detract from our specialness. In fact, our specialness is confirmed because we are alone. Or, to put it another way, we're so distant from extraterrestrial neighbours that we are practically alone. A divinely ordered anthropic principle, we'll come back to this so-called anthropic principle in a moment. So, there we are, we could well be alone. And even if we begin to suspect we're not alone, that there could be or should be life out there, there are nonetheless a number of what you might call cosmological hesitations and limits. Now, I'm sorry this is a fairly dense slide, and I'll read to you the bottom part of it. But just the red bits there. There's a great silence, perhaps because we're too young to look at another red phrase. We're too remote, or we're too primitive, or a great filter has wiped out all the competition, as it were, for life. So just run your eye down there for a moment. Too young? You see, if we can go from cave dwelling to internet and robotics in a mere 200,000 years, what would a civilization achieve in 10 billion years? We might just be too young to even be players in the game. Distance, we're just too remote. Too primitive, we don't have the right technologies yet. Commentators, science writers who ever make points like this about being too primitive, nonetheless keep saying things like we're on the verge of quantum technology that could, of course, really make us players in this game of extraplanetary exploration and travel and so on. Or, deeply unsettling, there could be a great filter and self-destruction. The great filter, as a civilization, you become technologically very sophisticated, but for one reason or another, you destroy yourself. You have competing factions, they have the ability to destroy the civilization, and they do that. That would certainly filter out our life. So we, in fact, have made it past the great filter. We keep flirting with it, don't we? Even at the moment. Or the great filter is still ahead of us. And what I say at the bottom is, down the bottom, is that another limitation is that maybe we've been using unsound definitions. For example, the assumption, as far as I can see, is that most discussions of extraterrestrial intelligent life assume that it must be carbon-based. But there's no absolute requirement for that. Might there be civilizations and intelligence that are mineral-based in ways inconceivable to us? And conscious, intelligent life need not be humanoid. It doesn't have to be embodied in bodies like ours. It doesn't have to be mammalian. In fact, we meet intelligent aliens on planet Earth all the time in the form of cephalopods. Cephalopods, the octopus is a member of the cephalopod family. Octopuses are extremely intelligent with a dispersed intelligence through their bodies. There are labs, there are biological labs up in Auckland where octopuses can distinguish one scientific inquiry from another, one scientist from another. They like some of them, other ones they hate and squirt inky stuff at. These cephalopods in the Auckland laboratories have worked out how easily to escape from their nice, comfortable aquaria. They can turn on and off lights, and they can generally cause havoc if they want to. So just a reminder to us that intelligent life does not have to have mammalian or humanoid form. And one of the rare intelligent and worth looking at films, what's the film I'm about to tell you about? The film called...
My Octopus Teacher?
No, that's around on Netflix. Arrival. It's this one here. The film called Arrival. And communication, I mean, there's what they arrived in. The communication is in the form of cephalopod-like squirtings of sign language of some kind. And then there is, I think you were saying, my octopus teacher. on Netflix as well. So there's a little sort of humbling reminder to us that intelligence doesn't have to be of the kind that we think it either might be or should be. So aloneness again. What if the anthropic principle is valid? I'll explain this anthropic principle in as simply as I can. The anthropic principle says the universe is fine-tuned for life, and we encounter that here on planet Earth. It's fine-tuned for life, and especially for human life. Its size, the size of the universe, is providential because of factors of time and distance. So rather than frightening us with the possibility of our infinite loneliness, the size of the universe should reassure us. It's a big universe, so that we can be comfortable in it and not necessarily harassed by arrivals or even the thought that someone else is out there, as it were. The universe is here so that we could be here. Life on Earth in particular may not be quite so ordinary after all. It might be a rare, albeit accidental gem, but does the anthropic principle necessarily exclude non-human extraterrestrial life? So these are debates from a non-theistic point of view, of course, but they are saying that the anthropic principle, the specialness of humanity, might be confirmed by our safe place in a big universe, but at the same time not exclude other forms of life in other parts of the cosmos. Now, is extraterrestrial life a religious or existential threat? Now, my answer to that is it's only a threat to religious people who fall for the encyclopedic fallacy. And I'll just start with the theistic tradition. Jews and Christians and Muslims only need to worry about extraterrestrial life if they fall for what I call the encyclopedic fallacy, namely that our Torah or our Bible or our Quran tells us all about everything. And since those texts do not really tell us about extraterrestrial life, we are safe because we are alone, and any talk to the contrary is both wrong and perhaps foolish and potentially dangerous. Now that's what's called the encyclopedic fallacy. It assumes that your religious book, Christians the Bible of course, must tell us all about all things. And since it doesn't tell us anything about extraterrestrial intelligent life, therefore that life doesn't exist. But that's to make the Bible, of course, into a kind of Wikipedia. In the Reformed tradition that I'm part of, it's put like this: the Bible does not tell us all about all things. It tells us what all things are all about. And we're in trouble, I think, if we miss that distinction. So just run you down the rest of this page. Most Christians writing in this area conclude that finding such life would be a natural extension of the gracious life-giving power of God. Anthony Lane, evangelical theologian at the London School of Theology: the age and size of the universe pose no threat to faith. There's nothing in Scripture to affirm or deny life on other worlds. Human significance is based on creation in God's image, not on our physical location in the universe or on our uniqueness. And you can read Thomas O'Meara. Perhaps God said 1,000,000 times, "Come, let us make new beings in our own image." Denoyer: Christians have always understood that the entire cosmos is a creation of God, that any life anywhere is a divine creation. Nonetheless, talk about extraterrestrial life does have an existential impact. There's a woman by the name of Patricia Wiseman. Anyone know Patricia Wiseman's current job? I've heard her speak a number of times at conferences. She's the scientific director for the Hubble telescope. No one gets even a second on the Hubble telescope without Patricia Wiseman giving the go-ahead. So she controls access. So she's well thought of in the astronomical realm. When I'd asked her to speaking, she said she's constantly invited to go and speak at churches and to various religious groups. And one thing that she finds is that she'll go to churches and explain to them the probabilities of extraterrestrial life, whereupon someone in the church, or perhaps its leader, will say, look, that's fine, we could cope with that. But my goodness, a lot of churches out there are going to be very worried. But then she'll go to another church, supposedly in this opposing camp, where they say to her, not a problem for us, but you know, there are churches down the road here, they'd be really freaked out by this. And the same with religious groupings. She goes and speaks to Muslim groups and Buddhist groups and so on, and they all say the same, we could cope, but those other religions, they're going to be worried silly by this. So quite just an amusing kind of twist that she puts on it. And you can't quite see down the bottom here, but Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction writer, brings out this notion of existential threat. This is a quote from something he wrote recently, before he died. Two possibilities exist. Either we are alone in the universe, or we are not. Both are equally terrifying. Interesting, isn't it? Mm. Both equally terrifying. And that's someone who isn't short on imagination, or wasn't short on imagination, but found both possibilities terrifying. The existential threat that I mentioned. Let me press on. There's growing theological interest and activity around the possibility of extraterrestrial life. About 8 years ago, there was quite a controversy in the States when NASA decided to fund, to give, $1.1 million to the Centre of Theological Inquiry, that's at Princeton University, to study the societal implications of astrobiology. Most of the money was captured, as it were, by this dude, Andrew Davison, Cambridge University Starbridge lecturer in theology and natural science. And he spent 2 years at CTI with a team of researchers focusing on the consequences of astrobiology for Christian theology. And what he wanted to do was, and this is mind-boggling for those of you who know anything about contemporary theology, researching and writing a systematic theology from the perspective of life elsewhere in the universe. So if extraterrestrial life arrives on planet Earth, or is in touch with us, how might a Christian person explain creation, sin, person and work of Jesus, redemption, revelation, eschatology, and so on? I see my main task is identifying and working with parts of the theological tradition that could directly bear upon the topic. And this from NASA funding, NASA wanting to know how could we communicate with these guys if they do happen to arrive. Andrew Davison is still busy on writing that book. He's told me its name, which we'll come to that shortly. Let's just see. Did I mention that in the... Oh yes, the book's due to be published this year. Its title is Astrobiology and Christian Doctrine. So watch for that on an airport bookshelf, airport near you sometime soon. Astrobiology and Christian Doctrine. He's promised to send me a copy so that I can get it reviewed in a New Zealand publication or two. So I've been in touch with him. He seems quite a friendly sort of guy. Okay, so where does this leave us? We're getting towards the end of our... In fact, this is only about 2 slides to go. The prospect of extraterrestrial life raises a number of these theological and conceptual topics. Oh, there's the clock over there. So what we've seen about the universe and its planets and stars and galaxies and potential for life, what does that imply? Well, the nature and character of the God revealed by God's creation, an extravagant, generous, and even profligate creator. I mean, what is the creator God doing by creating 10 to the 14 exoplanets? Is it nothing? I don't think that's an answer we can easily pursue, given, for example, in the Bible, the notion that the heavens, the created order, as we look at it, discloses to us the greatness of God. Well, what does this profligate planet-forming exercise disclose to us about the nature of God? I think that's a question that we should face. The wisdom literature, for example, Proverbs and Psalm 19 and Romans 1, all say to us that observing the created order leads to some sure conclusions about the nature of God. Well, what I've just talked about, what conclusions might that lead to? And my own comment here, it seems profoundly wasteful for God to create such a vast universe and only create life on one tiny rock. That's really what we're left with, perhaps. Just as God created and allowed stars and planets and the trillions to form over the universe, it seems reasonable that God would cause or allow a comparable number of life forms to emerge on other planets revolving around these stars. Now, that then throws up other sorts of questions. What kind of creative activity is God involved in here? Because when you look at some of these planets, you've got to reach for words like diversity, randomness, intentionality, risk, because there are some bizarre planets out there. Planet-forming environments are more complex and chaotic than previously expected. Why? Some carbon-rich exoplanets appear to be made of diamonds. It rains on these planets, but what it rains is giant, large rocks of pure diamond. There's a Jupiter-sized planet that's been identified, orbiting a tiny dying star at breakneck speed. Yes, there's a planet the size of Jupiter orbiting a dying star every 3 days. In other words, it's going pretty fast around its sun. One planet, Celt 9b, orbits another star, Vega. Vega is the 5th brightest star in the human sky. The surface temperature of this planet is 3,200 degrees. Fairly warm, isn't it? This is a planet that is iron rich. All the iron exists in gaseous form only, apparently, on this planet. That's what's called a little bit bizarre. There are supersonic winds and rocky rains forecast on a lava planet. And one distant planet, astronomers now say it's onto its 2nd atmosphere. What's going on there? It used to have its 1st atmosphere, for one reason or another. It's now got a 2nd atmosphere. The vaporized crusts of, these are very recent papers that I've been looking at, the vaporized crusts of Earth-like planets have been found around dying stars. Vaporized crusts, all that is left. So this is the huge variety that there is, and certainly those sorts of words in terms of risk and intentionality and so on have to be applied. So uniqueness, Earth's place in the cosmos, raises all sorts of questions about that. But another question that extraterrestrial life might answer for us is that, are there aspects of the living God unknown to us? Our earthbound and limited knowledge, and our knowledge of God, of course, is finite and fallen. Could our knowledge of God be expanded? And you could answer along the lines of the word in creation complements or reveals aspects of reality beyond what the word in Scripture discloses. See, is there anything we might learn about God beyond what Scripture tells us, given the universe that God has created? I think the answer to that is probably yes. And at the same time, there's increasing Protestant openness to the realities and promise of natural theology, which had fallen into disrepute, but that's been turned around, I think. And so there are some possible benefits and advantages of exo-discoveries. As I say, the search for such planets might raise interest in the habitable ones. Could such planets one day in the far future provide resources or even shelter for humanity? Will astrotheology result in a modesty-forming decentering of humanity in cosmic dimensions? What I'm saying there is that if we do find a universe that is rich in alternative forms of life, created by the same creator God that we know, that might just induce in us a little humility. We might stop thinking we really are the centre of the universe and so important. Maybe there'd be a humble dimension to our existence and the ways we act if that were to be the case. One last slide and then the summary slide. The word in Christ, AstroChristology, is a new, those of you interested in new thesis or research areas, AstroChristology. There's a topic that has potential. God's provision of redemption for extraterrestrial life. Is redemption in Christ a unique event for planet Earth or cosmic universal? And there are hints of both. I think the New Testament, you could say yes to each of those. If extraterrestrial intelligence exists, it may or may not be fallen. Obviously, we don't know. Andrew Davison, that I've just talked about, my attention has been mainly focused on Christology, most significant questions. How would we respond theologically to the prospect of life elsewhere in terms of there having been many incarnations or only one? You see, what the incarnation for Christians on planet Earth is that God comes to live among us in order to do his work of revelation and redemption. Would that look different if God had to do that same work elsewhere? I think the answer is, of course, yes. Other theologians embrace and apply a cosmic logos Christology. The Vatican astronomer is quite interesting here. Aliens will have been subject to Christ's saving grace. With hindsight, might we see a new depth for, quote, I am the good shepherd. I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock and one shepherd. Who said that, by the way? Jesus. It was Jesus, wasn't it? I'm just quoting from John 10. Now, you can't take that passage in John 10 and say, therefore there must be life elsewhere. But what this astronomer, Brother Guy, is saying is that with hindsight, if we do find intelligent life, we might read again John 10 and think, I hadn't realised that. So that's another speculative possibility. Okay, time now for questions and comments, and to help with your questions and comments, here's the summary that I promised. So we started off on the top left, then we talked about the great silence, and just below the hesitations and limits about being carbon-based and humanoid, I summarise aloneness and the hesitations and limits about what life should be like, could be like, and whether we should be messaging. So we talked about that. Top right, how should we react to extraterrestrial life? It gave those four possibilities. Formidable time and distance issues mean we are practically alone, even if we're not really alone. Aloneness is possible while preserving the anthropic principle that the universe, at least our aloneness in our part of the universe, is because of a divine ordering of things. That may or may not comment on the rest of the universe, of course. Is extraterrestrial life a threat? belief or the earth as a whole, growing theological interest, a sample of conclusions for faith, most of them positive, I have to say, an extravagant, generous creator plus a cosmic Christ, and the question whether ETIL could reveal more of God, and AstroChristology as local or cosmic. Well, there we are. That's an up-to-date survey, really, of what the great ones are saying about this topic of extraterrestrial life. So, perhaps with some guidance or help from David, we invite, especially for our videoed audience, your comments. What do you think of that? Am I onto something in this kind of summary? And what are your questions, either to me or to the points of view that I've represented here tonight?
All right, thank you, Bob. As Bob has suggested, we have plenty of time for questions here, and so we invite them, and I'll only step in and moderate if there's anything problematic.
If any fighting breaks out, David will.
I'm the moderator. So any questions from anyone?
Or comment. What do people think about this as well as questions? Start on the left.
Sure. So, with the Bible saying that Jesus is the only way to the Father, how then could we think about this, what did you call it, AstroChristology?
Yeah, Christology, yes.
Yeah.
So John 14, Jesus saying he's the only way to the Father. The way I'd answer that question is to ask, who asked Jesus a question about that? It was a representative of a little frightened group of his disciples, saying, if you're leaving us, how can we get to the Father? So this is on the night before Jesus dies. The disciples are quite frightened, that's clear. He's told them he's about to go. They're shocked, aren't they, by that? And Jesus reassures them by telling them that he is the way to the Father, and that anyone can come to the Father through him. Now, what that has to say about a cosmic audience who might ask a similar question, I don't think Jesus' answer has to be constrained and restricted just to the audience, but the audience asking that question had something in mind. Other intelligent life will have other questions, and since God was in Christ reconciling this world to himself, could God in the cosmic Christ not redeem other questioners in ways appropriate for them? So I think that's how I would answer it. John 14:6 says nothing about other religions, and it says nothing about other civilizations. We can't use John 14:6 as a kind of club with which to beat other religions and potentially other intelligences to doing or believing things our way. That wasn't the intention of John 14, especially John 14:6. Now, another comment.
Okay, thank you. I have a bit of a cynical question, and if you let me explain it a bit,
Yes.
I'll see what your response is. My question would be, why are there so many resources being put into this? I understand human curiosity about science fiction, and it's an interesting thing, and I love reading and watching movies, and we all do. But when I hear about NASA spending millions of dollars in the pursuit of this, when I get quite irritated when I think of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson spending their billions on the exploration of space with almost nothing to show for it, when we have human suffering in this planet right now. Why aren't they spending money feeding, housing, and caring for people on this planet? So other than just curiosity about what else might be out there, why do you think governments and individuals are spending so much of their brilliance and dollars on trying to figure this out, when most likely we won't figure it out anytime soon? What's your thought on that, sir?
Well, you could always say it's not an either or, it is a both and And some of those names, if you've mentioned, have been reasonably generous, philanthropic speaking, in terms of, but others are clearly in the game for personal prestige and all the rest of it. Living in democratic societies, which on the whole we prefer to live in these days, don't we? Surely all we can say is people have a right to make a pitch for what they want to spend their money and government's money on. Make your argument. Most of those arguments have to go through some kind of vetting process. Maybe it's the loudest voice that will win, but I think I'd rather do it this way than live in an autocratic regime where the questions could only be answered either for or against what we're talking about by the mandate of one person or a tiny unrepresentative group. That might be good at times, but on the whole, those kinds of autocratic decision-making principles actually make the poor worse off. Just look at the countries that are involved. So I'd want to go for a both and, if I could, and appeal to the advantages of democratic decision-making. Yeah. So that was a question. Others might want to comment on that in a moment. Was there a second part of your comments? Or?
No, I appreciate that. It may have been how you heard it. I didn't intend to think of that as the relative values of democracy or autocracies. I meant it more as what would anyone's motivation be to spend their thought cycles and money on figuring this out when I see, as curious as I am, and I'm a science teacher, so I'm very curious,
yes.
But what practical benefit
Yes.
are we expecting to get in any kind of short term versus very real and practical needs that we could tackle now with the people that we know exist?
Well, one answer I'd give is that I'd rather we were ready, if there is a potential arrival, and within, I think, the next decade, we'll have a much clearer idea if there is life out there. I'd rather be ready for that life. I'd rather that we as a human species were ready for the challenges of that than suddenly being overtaken, having been told, well, you can't answer that question, it's got no value. I'd rather we were ready for it. Now, that introduces questions of scale and so on, and I'd rather have those questions answered. I'd still go back to the advantages of democratic answers to autocratic answers. Autocratic answers might go the exactly opposite way than you might prefer. Democratic, we might have some ability. And the other thing I think we might have to say is, and again it relates to your calling as a science teacher, there's an awful lot of things, isn't there, in the world. I mean, I've been reading Bill Bryson yet again, and Bill Bryson keeps on pointing out unexpected scientific discoveries that came because of people tinkering with this or imagining that or curious about this or that. There seems something about the creative urge within us, both to find out and to do stuff, that science at its best can capture and enrich humanity with. And science on the whole, I think, has done that. I'm glad that I am the heir of Western scientific curiosity. And yes, the balance has been unusual at times, or extravagant or unwise, but I think I'd rather live in that kind of, partly because the wisdom literature in the Bible is full of this idea of exploring, observing, exploring, drawing conclusions, understanding the bad stuff when we use wrong cause and effect chains and so on. So something about creativity being made in the image of a profligate creator God, because that's apparent, I think, from this kind of... Anyway, come back to me in a moment, because I'll just ask if there are for other comments and questions as well.
John, did you have a question?
Me?
Yeah. I thought I saw your hand up.
Oh, I didn't put my hand up, but I do actually have one.
Okay, sure, sorry.
I was listening to a video recently on this topic of aliens with Christianity.
Yes.
And they made an argument, the people in this video, about the definition of being human, and I think they use one from maybe Aristotle, and that humans are rational animals.
Yes.
Animals in that we have a physical body, and rational in that we have a rational soul or mind. And they said if that's what it means to be human, and then we discover life on another planet, or they discover us, and they too have physical bodies with rational minds, they could fall under the banner of being human, and therefore Christ's redemptive offer applies to them as well. And I wanted to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, well, I'd be rather hesitant quickly to apply the word human. I mean, if there is extraterrestrial life that can communicate with us, that raises the whole God question about why, because see, most of the scientific framing of these issues, and you've heard me echo it fairly faithfully, is, well, there are natural processes at work within the universe. And that implies a kind of wholly naturalistic understanding. The universe is basically atoms and molecules and energy. And for some strange reason, consciousness and life emerged from it, which of course is the question that an atheist cannot answer. Why has consciousness and intelligence emerged from the natural order if the natural order is all that there is? So the whole God question, I think, is raised by the fact that consciousness and intelligence emerge from the natural order, which otherwise looks completely barren. Now, if that happens in other civilizations, consciousness and intelligence and the ability to communicate, I'm willing to pose the question, why is that? Where does that come from? And of course, the theistic traditions have always said it's because the Creator God is a God who, out of love, continues to press his creation towards intelligence so that it can have a relationship with him, the Creator God. Now, if that happens in other civilizations, in extraterrestrial civilizations, I'm going to give God the credit for it. I'm going to say, whoa, this is good. This is good. This is one in the eye to the Stephen Hawkinses and the Richard Dawkins of our world. The fact that intelligence and consciousness in particular emerge from what you'd think couldn't possibly produce intelligence and consciousness. But it's here. And we know why. Believers in God know why. So that's the kind of line that I take there. And so I wouldn't call these other beings humans. I would still say, in some sense, they, like we, will reflect the image of God if God has made them. So I don't know that I'd call them humans. I'd say they are whoever they are. They might have their own name, and I'd be happy to apply that, knowing that the Creator, God, is responsible for them. I've just been reading Colossians 3, which makes it very clear that all of these principalities and powers and all life, wherever it is, Christ is, because Christ is the Logos and the Creator, is responsible for their creation and their sustaining. And another part of Colossians, and for their redemption as well. So I'm happy with all of that. And there was another comment from
Nick
yes.
down there.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. Jumping off that question we've just had now, do you think it's possible that God could create conscious creatures that are not spiritually aware, so that are not in a state of unfallenness or fallenness?
Cats and dogs?
Intelligent conscious creatures.
Cats and dogs.
Okay.
No, I say that quite seriously because there are some quite conservative Christian theologians in the United States, ones who are quite near the fundamentalist end of the spectrum, happy to say to people, you'll meet your cat and your dog again in heaven. Because if God's gone to all the trouble of making them intelligent and conscious, this is not going to end in their death, just as it's not going to end in your death, kind of thing. So that's interesting. So if you could make a case for that, that cats and dogs and horses and so on have souls, and that their redemption is possible, and will be possible on an eschatological scale. So that's one kind of answer, and it will be quite easy to extrapolate from that kind of thinking, even without appealing to these particular theologians. I'd say you can make a case for that happening. I wouldn't want to draw too many parallels with human religions, but Heather, my wife, and I, we've been under the tutelage of Zen masters over the years, because we've owned cats. Yes. If you own a cat, you're under the supervision of a Zen master. It's true, isn't it? I mean, dogs have masters, but cats only have servants. Yes. But I think we could. So that's the kind of answer that I think I could give to that. This is speculative, isn't it? But I think, there's some answers there.
It seems to me that it's very plausible that there could be conscious creatures that don't have any particular spiritual status with God. So you've talked about here how they we'd expect there to be some extended Christology, say, that includes these creatures in God's redemption plan. But I can see how that might go either way.
Yes, it could, especially if we, the moment we talk about Christology, we often simply refer to the human Jesus, the Jesus who walked and lived among us. But of course, this Jesus is the Word, the cosmic Word made flesh. And whether the cosmic Jesus made flesh comments on everything that we've just been talking about, I think he doesn't. But if he really is that logos, that creating and ordering and sustaining principle for all life everywhere, and I think you can make a strong case for that from all the logos teaching in John's Gospel, for the logos teachings and the cosmic teaching, particularly in Colossians and Ephesians and the book of Revelation. When you put all of that together, you've got a Christology, a cosmic Christology that I think can easily embrace the whole of the created order, whether it's cats and dogs and horses on planet Earth, or intelligent, communicable, soul-bearing life anywhere in the cosmos. That wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. Other questions? Or
in the back there, yeah?
Oh, yes.
If at the end of time the earth is going to be restored,
Yes.
would that indicate that if there is any life, that it would be benign? Because thinking that if the earth is going to be restored, surely it couldn't then be under threat from anywhere.
Yes. Well, I think you're right. In the meantime, since God has ceded sovereignty and freedom to us, we have an awful lot of potential to mess things up and make planet Earth very nasty to live on before God does the restoring and creating of a new heaven and a new earth. And notice that phraseology, a new heaven and a new earth. And the new heaven, of course, usually in Scripture, heaven doesn't just mean a place we go to when we die. It means the whole of reality, the whole of God's created reality beyond the material existence that we temporarily inhabit here on planet Earth. So a new heaven and a new earth has got enormous potential. And it's impossible to describe in human language. Because it's just that human language cannot cope with all that is implied by a new heaven and a new earth. That's why human language, we've got Resurrection Sunday coming up. Human language can't really cope with Resurrection Sunday because we don't have the words and the abilities and the conceptual imagination to cope with the resurrection of one person from the dead. That's why we can't really adequately describe a new heaven and a new earth when it is all redeemed and renewed. So plenty of scope, plenty of plenty of wonderful surprises in store for us, and if we can't tie it all together conceptually, that's what you'd expect, that you couldn't do that. So I'm agreeing with where you're taking it, but I'd want to put it on a cosmic, I think a cosmic scale is foreseeable and understandable there as well. Yes.
Ronnie.
Could you say what you meant by natural theology?
Well, natural theology is, so theology is to do with what we know about God. And what do we know about God? How do we know about God? Well, just to use one simple analogy, the Protestant scientists who launched a good deal of Western science and technology constantly spoke about God has written two books for us, the book of Scripture and the book of creation. The older of these two books is the book of creation. Creation speaks to us. So Genesis 1 and 2 and 3 talk about what creation tells us about God. The Psalms do that. Psalm 19 I love, the heavens declare, the heavens speak about God. Romans 1 talks about what the created order tells us about God. All of the wisdom literature tells us about. Now, Protestants have on the whole tended to downplay that, thinking that's all trumped by Jesus and trumped by the Bible, sometimes to the exclusion of what the created order itself tells us. And I would tell students at Laidlaw that the created order is something that speaks to us about God. There are things we know about God and reality that we only know by looking at creation. The Bible doesn't tell us about a number of things, because the Bible doesn't tell us all about all things. It tells us what all things are all about. And some of that comes to us by looking at the created order. Now, natural theology is a theology that looks at the world of nature and creation and says, what does this tell us about God? And Protestants have often been uneasy with that, thinking that this somehow demeans or diminishes Scripture and Christ. I think the opposite. I think it enlarges our understanding of Scripture and of the nature of God. So that's what I mean by natural theology, but I must tell you, lots of Protestants are very suspicious of natural theology. It's making a comeback at the moment, which I'm very pleased about, led by some evangelical theologians. Alison McGrath at Oxford is one of a number who are rediscovering natural theology. Going back to John Calvin. John Calvin was a great fan of natural theology, but not in the Roman Catholic form. And that's what worried many Protestants, because Roman Catholics have pushed this natural theology quite strongly, and if Catholics do it, we don't want to have anything to do with it, which I think is foolish and demeaning, really. So that's what I mean by that. But I'll tell you a bit more if you want to, because I don't want to send all these people to sleep quite so soon. Bruce.
I guess what you presented gives a wide range of possibilities that scientists and theologians have grappled with. But as I think through it, I guess some of them I think most of us would feel reasonably comfortable with. If we happen to be the only species in the entire universe that has a special relationship with God and that has this intelligence, then, well, biblically we're okay with that. But as Christians, what are the ones that you feel maybe a little bit uncomfortable about this possibility? Like, for example, one that I think I would feel a little bit uncomfortable with is, say, a couple dozen or maybe even 100 different species from around the galaxy or the universe. At some point in time, we make contact with them, and we talk to them about Jesus, and they say, who? And, they have no idea what we're talking about, no conception of a God or a Jesus or something like that. Now, I know that there's still a possibility in there that our Jesus covers all of that. But does any of that make you uncomfortable in your research or reading?
No, because I've escaped from the Jesusology trap. And I want to be careful in explaining this. But as just look at what I've told you about Logos Christology. particularly say in Colossians and Ephesians, that's not talking about Jesus. It's talking about Christ. Jesus is Christ stripped of his divine credentials and qualities, isn't it? That's what it says in Philippians 2. Jesus didn't grasp his equality of God, but emptied himself of those things. So if we go saying to people, it's only Jesus, the whole universal thing must be about Jesus. No, it isn't. Jesus was for us on planet Earth. Christ, the cosmic Christ, who became flesh in Jesus, but there's an awful lot more to Jesus than what we saw walking around Galilee. So I drop all that talk of Jesus. I'm not going to talk to aliens about Jesus. I'm going to talk to them about the cosmic Christ. Well, I'm basically going to talk to them about the living God known to us. So just as we are in touch with anthropologists, the Christian ones are quite good at this. They say that they have never, Christian anthropologists say there is no community on earth that is religionslöse, without religion, because they all have knowledge of a creator being. That's where we start. So that will be true on an extraterrestrial scale as well. So we don't go saying to the aliens when they arrive, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. You know, we find out what their knowledge of the Creator God is, because there will be some. There must be some. And do you know this Creator God that you've said yes must exist? Do you know this Creator God? Or do you know about this Creator God? And see what they say and take it from there. Yes. So I won't be giving them Winky Pratney tracts. Was it Winky Pratney? Mm-hmm. Yes, I won't be giving. I'll be handing them out too. I won't be getting Andrew Davison to translate those into whatever. But we will start somewhere else, and I'll be interested to see what his book says about this kind of issue. Yeah. Yes.
So, looking at the probabilities
yes.
of there being intelligent alien life out there, one of the factors involved was the likelihood of intelligent life evolving, right, on planets. Seems to me that right now the sample size that we have is 1, and so we don't have any good understanding of
yes.
whether or not this is something that's likely to happen.
Yes.
If you're an atheist, I think you should believe it's likely to happen because we know it's happened at least once.
Yes.
But if you're a Christian, you might want to say that this is something that's happened one time in a miraculous way.
Yes.
So the question is, I suppose, is why should we think that there is intelligent life out there? Should we perhaps remain neutral until intelligent life actually presents itself?
Yes, I'm quite happy to wait and see. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, because I'm a curious kind of person, and because the created order is meant to talk to us about God, I think I could sum up my basic position by saying I would not be surprised if the God who is constantly seeding the universe with all the precursors of life hasn't actually added that last remaining seed of intelligent, conscious life. I wouldn't be surprised by that. I think it's likely, but like you, we only have one confirmed case of intelligent, conscious, material life, but we have all the precursors everywhere, and I just wonder what has God been doing in creating these trillions and trillions of planets with their own independent existence, although sort of dependent upon their host suns. Why is God doing that? Just for fun? Or Is there? So I'm happy to ask that kind of question as well, because why is quite a good question. Yeah. But I'm not certainly going to try to force my answers or possible answers, but I'm open to all those answers. Good questions and comments.
Maybe we'll just take a couple more.
Yes.
And then we need to give you a bit of a breather, I think. So, what?
Let's say that there are a number of different species on different planets that bear the image of God, and they're fallen. Do you think it's possible that other members of the Godhead, apart from the Son, could become incarnated as these creatures and therefore die for their sins?
Yes.
Or could the Son, the Christ, the second person of the Godhead, be incarnated as multiple species?
So the question about life elsewhere, did you say fallen or not fallen?
Fallen.
Fallen,
so
yes.
They need salvation, basically.
Yes, they need salvation, yes. I think I'd be just a little bit cautious there. We know that the species that we belong to is fallen.
Mm-hmm.
Plenty of evidence for that. Fallen and needing redemption. I just wait and I don't know, it automatically therefore follows that every other form of life, should it exist elsewhere in the cosmos, must also be fallen. But if it was fallen and they were not able somehow to fix that, because we weren't, we tried a number of things as a species, none of them have worked, just made things worse. We've proven that over and over again. So I'm just going to remain open to whether these other forms of life are fallen or not, and what the word is. And the one thing about our Creator God is that our Creator God is both immensely loving, an immense fount of tenderness and love, which is why he reaches out to pretty awful people like us. And secondly, he's powerful enough, one way and another, to fix the problem. Loving and tender, powerful enough to get his great arms around and fix things. That's the only hope you've got. It's the only hope I've got. And I'm glad I've got that hope. So that's the nature of our God, and how God fixes the problem elsewhere. I imagine a God of immense tenderness and power can do it. And I wouldn't want to imply how it ought to happen. I'd just leave it at that. Yes.
Final question, back there.
Yes, final question.
So, when just before the flood, God said something like that he despaired that he had made humanity, or some words like that.
Yes.
So, do you think he would do it again? And run that risk of the fall and it wouldn't, the whole process.
You mean elsewhere in the cosmos?
Yes. And if he sees that's what's happened here, why would you repeat it somewhere else and hope for a better outcome?
Especially since whatever the age, you think the age of planet Earth is, say planet Earth's only 3.7 billion years old, then these failures for civilizations billions and billions of years older than us, it wouldn't have happened after us, it would have happened a long time before us, probably. All I can say is that I imagine God can cope, and I don't want to be in a position of trying to tell God how he should have coped by not doing this or that a number of billion years ago.
So it may not have happened in those
It may not have happened there.
It might have been the
And it might happen billions of years into the future. Yes. Yeah. But the God we know is a God who takes risks and who has seeded freedom into the world. I mean, that's the only plausible answer, I think, for the existence of most human-made evil in the world, is that God, being the God of freedom, has imbued us and planet Earth with risky potential. The earthquakes that produce life giving earth forms and responsible for the atmosphere that enable us to live here, also can cause harm and evil. So God's willing to take that kind of risk because the good is greater than not ceding freedom. So if God's done that with us, he may well do the same elsewhere.